Sherlock Holmes, renowned for his unparalleled deductive reasoning, had always been able to solve the most intricate and confounding cases. His sharp mind, his uncanny ability to piece together seemingly unrelated clues, and his confidence in logic had made him a legend. For years, Holmes had navigated the world of crime and deception with a sense of invincibility, always believing that if the evidence was available, the truth could be uncovered. He was a man of facts, of reason, and of order in a world often consumed by chaos. However, a case arrived that would test him in ways he could not have foreseen, a case that would challenge the very foundation of his beliefs and break him in ways he never imagined. The case began as any other. A young man named Michael Thornton was accused of the brutal murder of a wealthy businessman, Edward Croswell. The evidence against Michael was overwhelming. His fingerprints found on the murder weapon, witnesses who claimed to have seen him at the scene, and even a motive that seemed to fit perfectly. Croswell had been a man of power, and Michael, a poor factory worker, had once been employed in one of his many factories. The wealthy businessman's death appeared to be a crime of passion, an outburst of rage from someone who had been exploited and mistreated for far too long. Michael, however, insisted on his innocence. Desperate, he sought the help of the greatest detective in the world, Sherlock Holmes. From the moment he took the case, Holmes's initial instinct was to dismiss Michael's plea. His reputation as an infallible detective had been built on his ability to cut through the noise and get to the heart of the matter. The evidence was clear. Michael Thornton had been the one to kill Edward Croswell. Yet something gnawed at Holmes. The facts, while seemingly conclusive, didn't sit right. The very notion that a man of Michael's background could be guilty of such a crime disturbed Holmes on a level he couldn't quite explain. Michael, after all, was not the kind of man Holmes had ever encountered in his line of work. He was poor, working class, and of no significant influence. It seemed far too convenient, almost too perfect a fit. Holmes, ever the pragmatist, began his investigation with his usual routine, analyzing the crime scene, speaking to witnesses, and examining the physical evidence. The more he delved into the details of the case, however, the more uncomfortable he became. As he unraveled the layers of Edward Croswell's life, Holmes discovered a man who had been a ruthless and corrupt figure, known for exploiting his workers and using his wealth and influence to manipulate the legal system. Croswell's factory had been a place of inhumane working conditions, where men like Michael Thornton had been subjected to long hours, dangerous tasks, and abusive treatment. Croswell's power extended far beyond his business empire. He had connections in high places, and he was untouchable. Holmes dug deeper, convinced that there was something more to this case than met the eye. He learned that Michael had been outspoken against the factory's conditions and had even organized small protests with his fellow workers. The young man had been a thorn in Croswell's side, someone who could potentially expose the truth about the businessman's exploitation of his workers. Holmes began to suspect that Michael had been framed, made the scapegoat for a crime that had deeper roots in the corrupt practices of Croswell's empire. The evidence that pointed to Michael was likely fabricated, a well-planned attempt to silence him once and for all. Despite his growing suspicions, Holmes found himself at an impasse. The law, the very system that had once been his ally, was now his adversary. The more Holmes uncovered, the more he realized how deeply ingrained the corruption was. Scotland. Yard, the police force that Holmes had once worked alongside, seemed unwilling to entertain his theories. They were satisfied with the case they had. Michael was guilty, and that was all that mattered. The trial proceeded with shocking speed, the media and the public already convinced of Michael's guilt. Holmes, whose confidence had never been shaken before, found himself in an unfamiliar and terrifying position. The case was no longer about solving a crime. It was about understanding a world in which the system was designed to keep the powerful in control and the powerless silenced. Holmes's usual methods of logical deduction and reasoned judgment were not enough to confront this injustice. The law, the very thing Holmes had trusted to uncover the truth, had become a tool of oppression. Michael was doomed to a fate he didn't deserve, and Holmes could do nothing to change it. The detective's mind, once sharp and focused, now felt clouded with frustration and doubt. He could no longer rely solely on the facts before him. The truth of the case was entangled in a much larger and more insidious web of social injustice. The evidence, the facts, the logic, they all pointed to one conclusion, but that conclusion was a lie. Michael Thornton was being sacrificed by a system that couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge the truth. Holmes realized, with a sinking feeling in his chest, that his deductive prowess was irrelevant in a world where corruption had already decided the outcome. As the trial continued and Michael was condemned to death, Holmes was left to confront the painful truth. He had failed. Not because the case was too difficult, but because he had failed to see the bigger picture. His reliance on logic and evidence had blinded him to the reality that, in a world rife with corruption, truth was often the first casualty. Holmes had spent his life solving crimes, uncovering hidden truths. But in this case, the truth was buried so deep within the system that it could never be unearthed. He had been wrong to believe that justice could always be served through intellect, alone. In the end, Michael Thornton was executed for a crime he did not commit. The system had spoken, and there was no room for the truth Holmes had uncovered. The case, the very case that had broken him, left Sherlock Holmes a changed man. He retreated from the world, no longer the brilliant detective who solved every mystery with ease. He had been forced to confront the limitations of his intellect, the blindness of his own biases, and the dark reality of a world where justice was often a luxury reserved for the powerful. Holmes never fully recovered from the case.